Good afternoon, and welcome to today's, or this week's, or this time's Volume 9, Ask the Rabbi. Okay, so we were unable to um, we were able to get through quite a bit of material last time. We didn't get through all of it, so we will pick up where we kind of left off last time. So um, we talked we talked about let's see. So some of the questions were kind of okay. Let's start with this question. I think this is where we left off. This is where I left the mark. Okay, so when we last left our heroes, we were discussing a lot of the laws of Shabbos, and so this question that came in was using a peeler, and instead using a knife. So when we last left off, we talked about using a peeler is a problem because of the fact that it's a kli for borer, is a utensil used to separate. And so you would be separating specifically the skin, which you don't want to eat, from the fruit or the vegetable that you do want to eat. And so therefore a peeler would not be great. Now some people didn't necessarily agree with that. They felt it was just another knife that you just would use. But our custom is to use knives. Is to use knives. So even though it was debated, that's the story with that. Okay. So even though we're approaching Rosh Hashanah, I have lots of sukkah questions. So let's talk about those first. We'll come back to Rosh Hashanah. If a non-Jew builds a sukkah, a kosher sukkah, can a Jewish man dwell in there during the Chag and recite the blessings? The answer for that is yes. There is something to be concerned about, however. It has to be built specifically as a sukkah, which means that you can't have it been from a pre-existing structure with skach underneath it. You would have to have a Jewish person do that. And a Jewish person should finish putting the schach on. So that way the schach is laid down l'shem mitzvah. However, and it technically would be acceptable if the non-Jew went ahead and put the schach down, but we are strict to go ahead and say you should shake the schach and adjust it slightly so that way a Jewish person completes the rest of it. Let's see. Someone asked some questions about cannabis. And so before cannabis became a permitted thing, it was not, there's no reason to talk about it being kosher. But nowadays, where it's now permitted in many different jurisdictions and can be consumed properly, it does require a hechsher because of the fact that it is broken down into its constituent parts. There's like the CBD part and its THC part, and these are different. These are different oils, and they are extracted differently. So, based on that, there needs to be certification of the actual food item, the food grade materials produced from it. If it was if it was prescribed to go ahead and use it for smoking, or if there's some other way in which it is imbibed but not through eating, then those would not require it to be kosher. But there's no specific prohibition on it. There are restrictions on using recreational drugs or using stimulants recreationally, which are discussed in poskim, things that would cause you to do things otherwise that were inappropriate. So, for example, becoming excessively drunk and all other types of behaviors are unbecoming of certain scholars and of regular people. Could be a problem that could touch on things like you're not properly listening to your elders, not properly listening to your parents. But there's no specific prohibitions directed at it. They may touch on other types of issues, meaning those issues are related specifically to your conduct and your conduct impacting other people. So, for example, we have some leniency on certain days, festivity-wise, meaning people are kind of okay with that. But on other days where you're not at your full capacity, people may not let that slide. So like on Purim, there's an understanding, okay, you might do something and, it's a small amount of damage. On any regular day of the year, people might be picky. But on Purim, they're kind of lenient about it because everyone's engaged in the revelry. But if it's, let's say, just a regular weekend, and let's say you use an item like cannabis and it impairs your ability to make good decisions, and you damage something, you would be obligated for those damages. So there's a number of different issues upon which it would touch, and that would be one way to kind of understand it. Okay, kosher question. If I heat up a pot of oil for popcorn, and 3 kernels are there, and right before one pops, a worm comes out of one, is the pot treif? So this question is addressed in the poskim. Pretty much everybody, except for the Chavos Yair, holds that insects are not kosher if you eat them, but their flavors are considered pagum, meaning they're considered disgusting, and therefore are not a problem as long as you remove the item. So in this case, that would be okay if you remove the wormy one, and that would be acceptable. Just remove it and you will be okay. The Chavos Yair has this weird tshuva that he seems to not feel that way. So I'm just pointing it out because it's there. He's a big Talmid Chacham, but no one is worried about his opinion. Okay. Okay, so the next question is, let's say you don't have a quorum of 10 for a minyan, okay? Can you fulfill this obligation with an online stream? Okay? Is davening in person with 10 other men an obligation or option? Okay, so let's break that up. So, number one, they have to be 10 adult Jewish males, okay? And we define adult as someone being over the age of 13 in one day. And that's just to be counted in the minyan. Technically speaking, there's a dispute about whether or not 13 in one day is enough. We hold that as long as you have the age, that suffices. But we rely on the fact that they probably have the signs of puberty when they've hit 13 in one day. So that's enough. However, that doesn't qualify them necessarily to lead the davening. The big thing now is that a little bacher, a kleiner bacher, is good to go ahead and just lead davening. Truth is that there are a lot of requirements to lead davening. They should actually have started a beard a little bit, and they should be married, right? And we're really strict about those things, especially on the Yom Noraim coming up. So you can be counted in a minyan, doesn't mean necessarily you should be leading a minyan. So those are 2 different things. Okay, you can't fulfill this obligation via online stream. Rav Hershel Schachter wrote a tshuva recently where he talked about listening to your obligations via Zoom and these other things to fulfill an obligation. He mentioned from Rav Moshe talked about if you leave it attached open and you connect to it, he felt that maybe you can fulfill your obligation. And he brought that from Rav Moshe, talk about people hearing Megillah this way and so on. Even though it was made available during COVID, it was meant to be like a shas of the chak, something used in rare circumstances, and not meant to be used as a regular situation. However, by a minyan, there is an absolute requirement that everyone has to be in the same space. So so you could fulfill an obligation if there was a minyan in the room and you're hearing it over the Zoom, but you couldn't add everybody up. No one permits that. And even still, it's highly unlikely that people would rely on this on a regular case. The reason why they say it's possible is because you're really hearing it over the phone, but you're not. So I actually have all shir on this, that there's no reason to rely on this at all. I actually gave the shir over COVID, and I said that the reasons for permitting it were not based on the correct assumption, especially now how we transfer information. Information is now digitized, compressed, extracted, and then it's basically not the same thing that you hear if you're in the same room. Plus, we see now that I could turn myself into maybe not on YouTube, but if you called me, I could turn myself into a cat or a lion face with the emojis. It's like ridiculous. I could change the whole background. So just not something that's not what the poskim were referring to, and they didn't understand this technology that we have now. They were thinking about a telephone where you take a zach and you plug it into the wall and it transfers the sound. I thought it was just the waves. It's more complicated than that now. So it's not the same item that comes out. Okay. Okay, so someone asked him about reading the ksuba over Zoom. That would be okay. The ksuba over Zoom, you don't have to actually hear the ksuba. There's no obligation to hear it. It's there to put a break in the services, so that way you can actually make another bracha, seven bracha for Shabbat brachos. You're supposed to break up the brachas erison, the part where you put the ring on the finger. In Ashkenazi tradition, I'm saying. In Ashkenazi tradition, you're supposed to break up the two events. You break up the ring ceremony and the Sheva brachos, the 7 blessings recited after the marriage is finished. The transfer of the ring is finished. So that's the deal with that. Let's see. So that ksuba you could do that with. Now, not a Sephardi one where you're doing the chuppah with the handshake and all the other transactions in person. That wouldn't work either. So and same thing too with the ksuba. Yeah. Okay. Next question was, what about premarital relations? So how do you determine all of your compatibility, and is incompatibility a reason for divorce, and all the other things? So generally speaking, we don't talk about these things kind of publicly, but just know that just know that these things are discussed with people who are getting married, and they're discussed privately at that time, because that's generally when we save it for that. So it's a Mishnah Chagiga that basically says these things aren't discussed in public, so we don't go over them, and that's I'll basically leave it at that. So these things you should discuss privately with your Rav and the rabbis you're working with to go over these things. Okay. So the next question is, this is a question. Okay, they said that notice that in mainstream Orthodoxy, excluding some forms of modern Orthodoxy, there seems to be a degree of caution, even rigidity, towards academia and higher secular education. And so let me just it's very long over here. So let's go to the question. So given that precedent, why is there such caution today in some parts of Orthodoxy towards academic and philosophical pursuit, when Jewish history itself shows that Torah and secularism can coexist fruitfully? So the Rambam was part of the Andalusian tradition. He is considered a great authority nowadays. So good question. So what was the resistance for it? So you have to go back to the beginning of where these issues were being developed. So you find that the initial resistance to it has to go back to the resistance to Hellenization. What was that resistance called? Well, it was called the Maccabean Revolt. How did that happen? So at a certain time period, Alexander rolls through Anatolia and rolls through the Middle East, and he happens to stop by this little kingdom of the Jews. Right? And they are governed somewhat independently under the Persian Empire. And he was trying to make conquests to the area. So the story is told, it's more in Sanhedrin, that he walks up to Jerusalem and he's met by the high priest Shimon HaTzadik. And Shimon HaTzadik, who was one of the members of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. In fact, he's considered the last living member of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, known as the Men of the Great Assembly, walks out to meet him. And people are very surprised because he walks out in the vestments of the Kohen Gadol, which are normally not supposed to leave the temple. So he makes an important temporary Shasadachak, Hara Shah, as they like to call it, temporary decree. He walks out in those robes to greet Alexander Mokdon, Alexander the Macedonian, as he's referred to. And he greets him there, and they agree to basically, have their allegiance to Alexander. Just, here's the way to the rest of the empire. Happy conquering. So that ushered in a sort of a very long peaceful period, a couple hundred years that existed between the Greeks and the Jews. And at certain points, the Greeks would kind of decide that the Hellenization wasn't going the way they wanted it to. The Jews were somewhat Hellenized, and they realized they were kind of not included in certain things that they didn't really totally Hellenize, meaning they didn't become super Greek. But the point was that at a certain point in during the Seleucid Empire, so Alexander's empire breaks up into three parts, and the Seleucids get the area over Jerusalem, and and uh, and the ruler at the time. So they had several rulers named Antiochus, and the fourth one was not as wise as the first three, and so. The problem was that he began to pressure the Jewish people to Hellenize more, and they refused and they revolted. So that was a big push against the Hellenization of Judea. Now, did all of Judea fall under the Maccabees immediately after? No, it took some time to kind of cement an actual kingdom and create a structure, and they kind of carved out a little corner of the Seleucid Empire for themselves, away from the Seleucids. And the Seleucids were kind of on the decline anyway, which happens in empires. Empires decline. Just look at Europe. Those are empires in decline. No, you don't have enough people to do your workforce. You don't have enough people serving your military. You don't have, right? So when all you have is money and you don't have a whole lot of anything else, you don't have enough people, you're in decline. So the pushback was against full Hellenization. So there were people who did study it. And I think that the opposition in general has been to draw a very definitive line between what Jewish scholars are willing to accept and what they are not. And so when it finds its way in the Talmud, that most of the philosophy that was rejected in the time of the Mishnah, meaning during the end of the Second Temple period, they were rejecting Epicurean thought and ethical hedonism and those type of things. They were not consistent with rabbinic thought. And so they basically were challenging those type of norms, and that's what sort of spread on into today. And Maimonides found it also. He said we were not going to accept certain things of thought of Aristotle, and certain things we will. And that's sort of been the pattern throughout history. So when there's resistance nowadays to it, the resistance is to basically understand that when it comes to studying things like psychology or other forms of modern science and pseudoscience and soft science and this thing and that thing, is at the end of the day you have to be secure in the Jewish belief system, and then you can look at and take useful parts of the other belief systems. And that's basically the main thing, is what we would like to refer to as the primacy of Torah, the primacy of Torah learning and primacy of Torah belief systems, and then everything else gets filtered through that lens. Let's see. What are your thoughts about converts isolating themselves because they're not interested in the community as much as practicing the Jewish religion? Well, we don't do that. So, are Orthodox Jews required to live in Orthodox communities? Yes. And then the other question is, can we live anywhere as long as we fulfill our obligations? Are we allowed to have our own interpretations of the Bible? After converting, what challenges do converts face in terms of assimilating into the community? And do Orthodox Jews participate in Valentine's Day or Halloween? Well, the last question is kind of like off the side. All right, well, let's go back to the main part about this over here. So everybody's required to be a part of the community. The Rambam brings down the statement of the rabbis that kol haporish min hatzibur, everyone separates themselves from the community. This is in Hilchos Tshuva. He says if you separate from, I'm pointing over here because of the Rambam right there, and he says in Hilchos Tshuva that someone who separates himself from the community does not get to see the community in its celebrations. Basically, you're not allowed to separate yourself from the community. The Rambam talks about specifically about a Jewish person who is surrounded by people who are regularly violating the Torah and regularly not living up to the moral standards of the Torah. You are allowed to separate yourself from them until you can find a way to find a community that fits your groove, and that means it has to be a Torah groove, and you're not allowed to make up your own exegesis of the Bible, and so you have to fulfill all the commandments. You have to be in the community. You have to do all of those things. Now the challenges are that sometimes you just sort of find yourself just not symmetrical with certain communities, and it's important to find a place where things work out. You want to find a place where things can work out well. But that's also why they shouldn't be having conversions done in communities where the rabbi doesn't work well with the convert. Now that also means you have to also use your judgment with this. I've seen a lot of rabbis who, that they just become, for whatever reason, they become particularly, particularly antagonistic last minute to their converts, and I don't really understand it. God does not excuse you from your behavior. Say I don't get involved in it. Well, if the convert goes off the derech because of your actions or your inability to cope with them being in your community, that's still your problem. So you have to either say, I don't want this person in my community. You can do that. You're the rabbi. Then you need to say that up front. But I've never understood these rabbis who act like there are certain things they don't have to do. So if you're a community rabbi, the expectation is you have to fulfill the needs of your entire congregation. If people need to get divorced, if people need to get married, if they have to have life cycle events. And so if you something needs to be done and you don't know how to do it, then you need to seek out the guidance to make sure that it's done. Or you should get a job that doesn't require you to interact with people. A lot of people just like to be rabbi because they like the title, and that's part of the egoism of modern rabbinics, and it's been carried on through generations. There's a tshuva from the Chassam Sefer, I believe, where he talks about people getting jobs. Actually, it may even be older than that. The tshuva may actually be from the 14th century to Rabbi Weil, but people used to appoint themselves or get appointments as rabbis of communities without the consent of the community. It floors me to see stuff like that, but it would happen, and it still happens. And I've heard of stories of where someone was asked to be a rabbi of a community. He says, "I don't want to live over there, but I will be your rabbi." So he used to act like he was in charge of them, and did all of that. So I don't know why he would think that was acceptable. If you turn down the job, they want you to come there and perform the ministerial tasks. I've seen rabbis here in the United States. I'm going to move where I'm comfortable, but I'm going to retain my position over here. Well, they could decide to no longer go to you, and someone else could stand up and say, "Well, he's not in the area." So there's a lot. It's not so easy, but the halacha does protect the interests of the communities, to hire people who have the community's best interest at heart. Now, sometimes some communities need a little kick in the pants, so it's on the rabbi's responsibility to go ahead and do that. But a lot of times you'll just get like some random Aish guy or Chabad guy who's woefully ill-equipped to handle many of these questions, and he needs to just sort of stay in his lane. And if he says, "I don't know how to do something," he should just say, "Listen, I'm not equipped for this. I will send you to somebody who is equipped." And that's it. And that's how they can do it. I had a conversation. I said, if they want your help, they want your help. They don't want your help, they don't want your help. So there's that. And participate in Halloween and Valentine's Day? No, they don't. Okay. Let's see. Here's another long question over here. Let's see. Here's a long question about Rabbi Yosef and the approach to Ethiopian Jews. Okay, so that's really something that is very involved. So I will tell you that I address that specifically in my book on the subject. So if you want, I don't want to hold everybody up on this question. It's a really good question, and so a lot of people. So the Rabbanut's feeling is now that Ethiopian Jews are full-fledged Jews, but if you're interested about the actual details, then I have a massive section in my book going into pretty significant detail. And so if you'd like a copy of that, just let me know. Next question: is it permitted to build a sukkah during Chol HaMoed? The answer is yes. You can to make it kosher again, you can do that. And then is it permitted to add more decorations to the sukkah on Yom Tov? No, for two reasons. Number one, it's muksa at that point, so you can't hang stuff on it. So that's the difference between the two things. But if it falls down, it's not kosher anymore. You can make it kosher again. Okay. How do you cite prayer for a meal with multiple food groups? So the question is, I think your question is, how do you cite a bracha for a meal with multiple food groups? So that's pretty involved. So you need to know all the different blessings, and you also need to know the the order of priorities of different blessings. So that's covered in Rabbi Bodner's book, which is on the reading list. So Bodner's book has a whole chapter, I believe it's either chapter 4 or chapter 7, that goes through priority of blessings. And so I would direct you to that to learn that in full detail. Okay. Let's see. Next question is how offensive is it to tradition to attach the sukkah schach prior to Yom Kippur rather than after it as recommended? Not a problem. As long as you're doing it for that mitzvah, it's okay. All right. The question is, a person blends together the following into a smoothie: bananas, strawberries, almond milk, dates, raw oats, and then they drink it as a meal replacement. What bracha do you make? So someone suggested, so shout out to Hannah Levenstein, who suggested that if it's a liquid, then it's shahakol, because you can't see the strawberries or anything else. Okay? Okay. So, however, it says raw oats in there. So because you have oats in there, if the oats are there to fill you up, now the bracha of the whole milk, of the whole drink becomes mazonos. But the oats have to actually be visible. So if the oats are in there to thicken it and not to make it like an oat drink, so then the bracha would be shahakol. So it depends on what the oats are being used for and how much quantity they are in there. Next question is, a person is dangerously ill on Yom Kippur, and their doctor, who is not Jewish, says they have to eat. And a knowledgeable, observant Jew is present and thinks the doctor is exaggerating, and another Jewish doctor says the patient could likely fast without monitoring. So who has the authority in this case? And that's our last question for today. So the answer to that is you always follow the most lenient opinion when it comes to eating. So even if it was a non-Jewish doctor who says that, you're welcome to rely on the Jewish doctor if you think that's okay. You don't want to not fast, but you have the right to rely on the lenient opinion. So unless most doctors won't say that a doctor is what's the word? Most doctors are committing malpractice, and if they were, then if he told you he was committing malpractice, then that's something else. So most doctors don't. So they won't go so far, because now it would open up the other doctor to a lawsuit. So especially nowadays. So therefore, you can rely on the lenient opinion in such a case. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to having more Ask the Rabbi sessions. Thank you everyone who listened, who attended, and if you want to catch us online, feel free to visit the YouTube channel, and make sure you like and subscribe and share. Have a wonderful day.